It wasn't really a bad plan. We'd stripped the car ready for paint, but it was cold and wet and horrible. We'd still got an engine to rebuild and all of the running gear to recondition. So what possible harm could it do to our schedule to put the body shop off for a couple of months until the spring of 2020?
Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's episode, Tickled Pink. Coming up in episode 33, I don't use the pillar drill. Nick doesn't make a bracket. And we both leave the shed. At the end of the previous episode, we'd treated the engine to some new timing triggers, some lovely new top feed injectors and a billet fuel rail. We'd wired all the sensors and components on the motor and made a brand new charge cooler to sit on the top. The engine and transmission is ready to go. But the car wasn't painted, and the body no longer merely sat there in the corner of the shed, it had now begun to seriously lurk. You can't, in all honesty, expect for the finished shell to be within spitting distance of the angle grinders without Nick feeling the need to fettle something, can you? Well, of course not. We've done loads. Stuff like modifying the bonnet catch and moving the latch. The main catch itself has been reinforced, and the latch has been moved to a more central position, closer to where they are on the very late Minis. We filled in all the superfluous holes in the top of the front panel, and hidden the springtail that stuck through, because it was hideous. Finished off the lower front panel where it had been relieved to make room for the flip front hinge. Also finished off and boxed in the main front panel to frame mounts.
Trimmed back and neatened up the rear bumper mounting flange.
Got rid of all the scabby surface rust and glue from where the headlining fits.
Bit of modification to the tunnel and a bracket for a dead panel.
And gone round every seam that's going to need seam sealer with the die grinder, just to take the top off the welds to make it all a bit smoother before paint.
I do mean all. An access route for the main earth underneath the seat rail, so the earth strap can be much shorter.
And we made a couple of dollies that bolt on in places where the paint isn't going to matter, because that's where the subframes bolt to anyway. This will allow us to move it around when it's at the paint shop. After all that, we put it aside and waited for another slot to become available.
Yes, it would have been very easy for me to become impatient and attempt the spray job myself. I've done it a few times before with varying degrees of success, but it would never have been perfect. Besides, it would have left this place in a hell of a mess, and not far from the Batcave is a guy that sprays cars for a living, and has been doing so for a very long time. I've seen a lot of his work and it is always top notch. As you can imagine, an artisan with skills like that is very much in demand and does not come cheap. So I've come to see my mate Tony instead. I jest, of course. This was always the plan, because Tony is the best paint and bodywork guy I know. Just up the road with his own spray booth.
Tony's a legend in his own lunchtime, but was understandably reticent about working with Nick for a few weeks. The success of any paint job is almost never down to the paint itself. It's down to the preparation. The paint is merely the icing on what should be, if we get our jobs right, a very well-baked, moist and tasty cake. After applying a small amount of filler in a couple of places, while it's going hard, our tame bodywork expert gets to work sanding back the roof. The black wasn't original and was in poor shape, so the decision was taken to sand it back as far as we needed. Through the black, into this beige colour, and down to the shiny metal where necessary. A few more blemishes in the main tub were attended to, until Tony declared himself happy. Well, as happy as Tony gets. And the car is wheeled into the paint booth. Once in the booth, we find it's best to shut him inside, not least because his singing is terrible. Before any paint goes on the exterior, the interior needs masking off. This is the first of many times the apertures need masking, but thankfully, Tony is quite adept. We could do it, but it would take us more than twice as long, so we skulked off, put the kettle on, and left him to it. When Tony's on it, he's really on it, and we have to scamper around with the camera to keep up. So it's not long before the shell is fully masked up and ready for the first of multiple coats to go on. Considering how long the shell's been kicking around and how many times I've bashed into it, it's remarkable how little filler was needed to get to this stage. Tony reckoned it could have been done with high build primer, but it was faster to just put a lick of filler on it. So with those defects sorted, the shell is treated to some panel wipe as the last stage before the gun comes out. Panel wipe to a painter is like brake cleaner to a mechanic. We use it for everything. And chances are it's the same bloody stuff, just in a different bottle, as it's basically just a solvent cleaner that removes any and all residue, ready for the first coat. Before any paint goes on the car, Tony has to dial in the gun. The correct spray pattern and volume is key to a good finish. The first of the coats to be applied is the etch primer. Etch primer is a paint that's designed to physically bond itself to the substrate to which it's applied. This is achieved by combining an acid with the paint, so that the acid microscopically etches the surface of the substrate and forms a physical and chemical bond between the two. The etch primer will give us a solid base to work from, especially on the areas of exposed metal. You've seen us using the grey stuff on everything we've made, but this time we've chosen an attractive bile yellow colour. The booth is heated by a paraffin-powered space heater in the corner behind the Mini, and even though it's the middle of winter and freezing outside, the booth is a toasty 27 degrees C or 80 in Fs. We haven't sped this footage up. I told you when Tony is on it, he really is on it. We're inside a downdraft booth, which has this colossal filter running the full length of it, where air is blown through from massive fans on the top. The air is then sucked out of the booth through this grate at the bottom. And you can see why a booth and an extraction system is so important, because all that yellow stuff on the grate is only from what you've just seen. Once the etch primer has dried completely, it's time for the high build primer to go on. This is a thick paint designed specifically to be sanded back to almost nothing. It will fill in small imperfections in the bodywork that are barely visible, leaving a beautifully smooth and flat surface for the wet on wet primer to go on later. We're giving the Mini 2 to 3 coats of this stuff depending on the panel to make sure there's enough thickness to sand back for a perfect finish. The first coat is complete and it's already looking like a different car. The advantage of using top quality paints and a top quality painter is that you end up with a finish in primer that's significantly better than the last top coat that Nick attempted. If a job's worth doing, it's worth getting someone else to do. The main shell has now had its second coat and is ready for some rubbing. But the shell is barely half of the surface area we have to contend with. We still have the front end, the bonnet, the doors and the boot lid to sort. So the shell gets wheeled out and in comes some stands with the rest of our bits to paint. One of the few remaining original panels gets the high build primer treatment. There's something oddly hypnotic about watching the bonnet being transformed in this way. After the second coat has been applied, the primer needs a couple of days to go really hard before we can get down to block sanding it. So while the curing is taking place, we've put the shell on the rotisserie to turn our attention to one place that won't need sanding at all, the underside. To be fair, I think we spoiled Tony by bringing the rotisserie, but he kept banging on about his poor old knees to such an extent that Nick finally relented. It does make this part of the job a shed load easier though, and more comfortable. There's no bare metal under here at all. It was all etch primed as we were building it, so before Tony was let loose with the primer, we cleaned the whole thing thoroughly, mainly with panel wipe obviously, scuffed it all with sandpaper to give it a key, and then blew away any remaining detritus out of all the nooks and crannies with the airline. This left us with a surface that we were happy to throw the primer onto. Paint really is the most transformative process when building a car like this. There are literally dozens of individual handmade parts under here. Some were installed years ago, some went on fairly recently, but the uniform grey of the primer now hiding the evidence, it looks less like a collection of parts and more like a fully formed car in its own right. Nick now has the unenviable task of sealing every single seam on the underside of the car before the next stage of the paint process. As everyone with experience of Minis knows, they're hygroscopic, so any and all attempts should be made to limit the ingress of moisture. Because of some of the decisions made during the build, there are more seams than usual, so the task took quite some time. You may have noticed a large area in the middle with no seam sealant at all. We'll come back to that in a minute. It may look a little untidy, as Nick's just smeared the sealant with a gloved finger, but once the next coating goes on, you won't see any of it, because it's Gravitex time! Gravitex is a hard rubber-based stone chip protection coating. It goes on thick, covers a multitude of sins, and the finish is rough, so Tony felt confident enough to let Nick loose with the gun, but not confident enough to let me loose with anything other than the kettle. You can get an idea of the rough finish of the Gravitex once it's dried in this shot. But why only coat the outer parts of the underside, I hear you ask? Well, running down the centre of the car is the prop shaft, the exhaust, the brake lines and the fuel lines, and quite frankly, there simply isn't enough space available in this area to accommodate the thickness of the Gravitex as well as the primer and the top coat. It really is that tight. So in this area, we're going to seam seal everywhere, but instead of smearing it all over the place, some targeted use of paddle wipe and some elbow grease means that the sealant remains only in the gap and we have a neat and tidy surface for the top coat to go straight onto. You've got to do this while the sealant is still wet. If it goes off, you're stuffed. Now repeat that process for every single seam underneath the car, and you can get an idea of the enormity of the task. Thankfully, Nick's right arm is very well practiced, and he completed the job with nothing more than a slightly hurty finger. The underside is now ready for the top coat of colour. But not yet. There's still a shed load of work to do before we can contemplate the colour coat. Like the arches, for example. They need the high build primer and a thorough blocking back. Talking of blocking back, there's a blemish in the roof that needs some attention. You can see by how much dust is being produced just how thick the primer has gone on. It sounds quite easily, so this pretty big dimple disappears in double quick time, and the surface once completed is beautifully smooth to the touch. You can see here the ripples in the unsanded areas, so the entire car needs blocking back to make sure that the surface is completely flat and blemish free before the next paint stage.
That's where the filler primer ended up. Most of it.
With the sanding complete, Nick's moved on to the lying down on the job stage of seam sealing. Moisture doesn't just come from underneath, it comes from literally everywhere. So in a decision he'll later regret, he's decided to seal every single gap and every single join on every single panel on the car. This is no small undertaking. I did try and reason with him, but he muttered something about Minis being porous and nowhere is safe from tin worm and various other justifications. I think we all know deep down that this thing is destined to be wrapped around a tree pretty soon after completion, but even after conceding this point, he still went mad with the sealant gun. Many of the seams are in hard-to-reach places that require the flexibility of a contortionist to reach. And let me tell you, there's barely anything less comfortable than lying prostrate on top of Nick's brackets. And no, that's not a euphemism. The engine bay is the last area on the shell to have been sealed, but there's still the front end to contend with another time. With Nick having a lie down after completing his own labour of Heracles, it was over to Tony to put on some more paint. The interior of the car is now complete, as is the underside. The separate panels have all been primed and are waiting for the top coat, and now the shell has been masked up again, ready for its coat of wet-on-wet primer. As well as the obvious large items, there's the door hinges, bonnet hinges, various mounting brackets, and of course the seam trims to paint. Before the final primer coat goes on, Nick's installing the clips that hold the seam trims in place. These are tight and will scratch the fresh paint, so they're going on now before the top coat. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. The car needs yet another wipe down before Tony breaks out the gun with the wet-on-wet primer. So that's the final coat of primer, and now the car is ready for the top coat. But what colour to choose? Well, the world's your oyster when it comes to deciding on a colour. Each manufacturer has their own palette. There's hundreds of books of swatches here with hundreds of colours in each book, so the choice is basically limitless. But once you've chosen your colour, how do you create the stuff that goes in the spray gun? Each colour has a specific code, and the code is a recipe. There's dozens of base coats here, one of which will make up the bulk of your ingredients. But there's also hundreds of different tints in these bottles, which when all blended together in specific quantities, make up your final colour. So let's say you wanted to blend Maserati Red code 290105. The computer system recognises the code and then helpfully breaks down the colour into its individual ingredients. For this demonstration, we want to make 1 litre of the paint. So the system tells you how much weight of each ingredient you need to add cumulatively to make a litre of the paint. It's very clever. There's no Maserati around here, but there is a metallic grey Suzuki Swift that needs some paint. So with the mixing pot sat on the scales, into the base coat goes some metallic grey, as you'd expect. Then a little bit of black, to darken it up, I guess. Then a splash of something that looks particularly dubious, but I'm told it's essential. Then some purpley type colour. All the while, Tony's keeping his eye on the scales to make sure the mix is perfect. The final part of the colour is orange, because of course there's orange in your metallic grey. Add in the requisite amount of thinners and you've completed the recipe for Suzuki Metallic Grey. It just needs a thorough stirring and that's the job done. So which of the countless colours has Nick decided to paint the Mini? This is the moment you've all been waiting for.
The vast majority of you will be very pleased to see this tin of British Racing Green, which we're not using, because I've chosen something much closer to the colour of magic.
It's white, isn't it?
Well, yes, but not as in snow, as in milk. Or, as it's known in the Mini community, Old English White.
Those with an interest in hippology will know that most white horses are in fact grey, which is apt given Nick's predilection. The paint is now being expertly applied to our steed, so while Tony gets on with that, I'll put the kettle on. Once all the metalwork got a coat, the experimental 3D printed wheel arches got some love too. If you missed how we did it, what are you playing at? Our Old English White now proudly adorns the Mini, and the finish straight out of the gun is fantastic. Although it should be, as Tony's been doing this for so long that one of the first vehicles he painted was with woad. So now he's painted the interior, all of the exterior panels and the underside, but there's one glaring omission: the roof. Tony's a dab hand with the masking tape, and in no time at all, the freshly painted Mini has taken to wearing a bag. We definitely don't want any of the next process to get on the white, so covering the car completely in plastic and carefully masking up the gutter to get an accurate, sharp line is key to the next stage. A final pass over with the DA was thought necessary before the last coat of primer. I'm sure most of you will have guessed by now, but it seemed rude to have an Old English White Mini without a black roof. This is a mist coat, a very thin layer of black that bonds to the primer and ensures that the next thicker coat adheres properly. This is the third and final layer of black base coat going on the roof. Unlike the white, which is a 2-pack paint and dries to a high gloss finish, this black base coat dries to a matte finish and needs a clear lacquer over the top to make it glossy. After wiping off any errant dust particles, Tony sets about putting 3 layers of lacquer over the top. Once it's dried, the glossiness is off the scale. It's been weeks of hard graft to get the paint job to this point, where it's essentially finished, barring a cut and polish. Colour sanding is where you smooth out the clear coat, so when it's time to buff the paint, you get the most mirror-like finish possible. This is not that. This is the beginning of an odyssey that only a lunatic could dream up. This odyssey is going to involve more clear coat lacquer, more sanding, more spraying, more masking, a lot more masking, a tailor's tape measure, a pen, a laser, and some patience. So while Nick gets on with that, I'm gonna get the funk out. Yes, Nick wants the iconic checkered roof, but with a twist. Instead of white squares, we're going to be painting them in pearl, which ends up sort of silver. But of course it's not as simple as that, and here I have to credit Colour Match Paints in High Wycombe, who patiently listened to our requirements and didn't once cry, "You want to do what?" Because as well as the white pearl checkers, we're adding a red pearl square, a blue pearl square, a purple pearl square, and a gold pearl square. Because, Nick, those 4 coloured squares have to be masked off individually before the white pearl checkers get sprayed on. And credit to you if you realise that they're the colours of our logo. The first of the colours is, of course, the white pearl, which makes up the bulk of the checkered flag on the roof. Then the entire roof needs masking off, except for the revealing of the single square that needs the purple pearl. Then the blue. Then the red. And finally, the gold. Then the entire roof needs unmasking to apply the lacquer over the top of the whole thing. That process had to be done quite quickly, because each of the layers couldn't be allowed to dry completely before applying the final clear coat, else none of it would bond together properly. But it had to be dry and hard enough to be able to mask off without marking the layer with the tape. It was quite the tightrope to walk. Through the noxious haze, you can see Tony applying what will be the last of 17 coats of paint on the roof. Yes, that's the 2-pack high gloss paint being sanded back, and that's another finish ruined by abrasives. But fear not, with the roof complete, the Mini needs a resplendent stripe to adorn the flanks. So we've affixed the doors and the front end, so Nick can painstakingly mask off 2 3mm wide stripes with a 3mm gap in the middle. This is not going to be your hot pink vinyl stripe you can pick up for 50p down at Motormania and slapped on willy-nilly. Nope, this is another one of Nick's infamous ideas that if we can pull it off, will look pretty darn spectacular. Because it's not just the meticulously marked out stripes that we're going for. On the rear of every Sports Pack Mini, at the end of the stripes was a rosette. And if ours works the way it does in theory, it's going to be ace. Once again, the car has been masked up, ready for another paint application. It took considerably longer to mask it than it will to add this layer. So this is yet another example of the prep work taking more time than the act. Ah, those were the days. Under all that brown paper somewhere is the front end. So with it all covered up, Tony can get to work adding the stripes. And with a few flicks of his well-practiced wrist, the pearl white stripes were done. Next job is the rosette thing. Excellent, we're nearly finished. This is the penultimate job, and it's 3 layers of clear coat lacquer. The stripes and the rosette will be underneath the clear coat, and while you'll be able to see them, you won't be able to feel them. It's all getting quite exciting now. The checkered flag is nearly in sight. But before we go any further, time for a brew. The lacquer has dried and it's now properly shiny. But it's not shiny enough for Tony, so the final stage of the paint job is a cut and polish. This process here is denibbing, using a very fine abrasive pad on a wet surface to take off any little bits of crap that made their way into the clear coat while it was being sprayed. Removing those lumps is important because Billy Big Balls here is confident enough in his own abilities to take the DA to the freshly painted surface. A DA, or dual action sander, doesn't rotate, it oscillates to mimic hand polishing, just at a much faster rate. This stops heat building up too quickly and burning the paint. You'd normally do this bit by hand, but Tony wields the 3000 grit soft pad like the pro he is. And anyway, it's his problem if he screws it up. Once he's happy that the blemishes have been removed, the final stage is the cut and polish. A cutting compound is a fine abrasive material suspended in a paste. It will polish out all of the tiny scratches made by the DA and leave the mirror finish that Tony craves. Every inch of the car is getting the treatment, despite this being one of Tony's least favourite jobs. That, and he doesn't trust either of us not to screw up his nice new paint job with the power tools. Following the cut is the polish, and after all the different toys that have been used in the lengthy build-up, it's fitting that the climax is achieved by hand. With a final flourish, Tony declares himself happy, and that's the paint job done. Although, it seems like a complete waste of 3 days, because I can't see any of the effects at all. Recently, we've been asked numerous times, how long does it take to paint a bloody Mini? Well, in this case, it was 9 weeks. That might seem an awfully long time, but this wasn't a straightforward blowover or colour change. You rarely start from scratch with a paint job, and we treated this like it was all bare metal. 5 tubes of seam sealer were used plugging every single gap on the car. Just that took some considerable time. Over 1,500 quid's worth of materials and consumables were used. Of course, it could have been done quicker, but this isn't a race. We just wanted it done right. Nick's vision for the paint effects took days to mask up, and that was after loads of trial and error getting the paint mix right. However, the result is stunning. Seeing it on the screen doesn't really do it justice. The effect is mesmerising. Depending on where you view it from, and more importantly where the light is, the coloured squares disappear. And while there'll be a final polish and protective coating once the car is finished, the shine is deep enough to dive into. On the bonnet, the subtle white pearl stripe contains our coloured logo if you catch the light correctly, and it's the same on the flanks. It looks even better in the rare winter sunshine. All in all, it's better than we could have imagined, and that's purely down to not only Tony's skill as a painter, but his experience as well.
And that is why you go and see a professional. So I've really got to thank Tony, not only for letting us invade his place of business, for giving me a much better paint job than I deserve, but mostly for not strangling me several times along the way. So, I think right now we're at the end of the beginning. See you next time.
Tune in next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky. Well, I guess we just got to put it back together now.